We've almost come to the end of Future Entrepreneurship 2021. Our final speaker is the Andreas Weigend. Nova, let's do this one final time.
Our next speaker is the main keynote speaker of this year's edition. His expertise is the future of big data, social mobile technologies, and consumer behavior. In today's increasingly digitalized world, consumers share data in unprecedented ways. The social data revolution represents a deep shift in how people make purchasing and lifestyle choices. Please welcome former chief scientist at Amazon and author of Data for the People, Andreas Weigend.
Thank you, Andreas, for joining us today. It's an absolute honor to have you as a speaker because many of our students see you as a role model. So, Andreas, take the stage. The stage is yours.
Thank you for having me. So when you asked me to give a keynote, I was reflecting on this and I appreciate it, but it is really no longer the world where, like in TED, people go on, they stand at the red circle, they start with a personal story, and then at the end, they step to the edge of the stage and they say, together, we can make the world a better place. Like any evangelical, preacher. So I think those days are over. And TED actually knows that. I got an email from Chris Anderson, who I've known for 15 years yesterday, asking whether rather than paying the $16,000 to go to the main TED, whether I would be considering making a $5 donation a month to be part of some TED community. Wow, the world really has changed. So, rather than trying to give the keynote here, I want to point you to three things. Number one is a keynote I actually did give in London in September 2019 at SWIFT, the Cybos conference, the SWIFT Innovation Conference. SWIFT is a company, of course, headquartered in Brussels, and they had me talk about the data dilemma. So if you want to hear a talk, which is with the, going to the edge of the stage and saying together and so on, then please check out the Cybos SWIFT conference from 2019. It has been a while. Well, then if you want to hear something which is more on the topic which we had talked about, the topic of identity and trust, please check out the wonderful panel I had in Bangkok in December 2019. And the link is onlaundry.com. Onlaundry.com. Because the conversation there really was, what about laundry, money laundering, identity laundering? We had somebody from North Korea speaking under the condition of anonymity. And we had a couple of people from Singapore where we learned about how many fake things are going on. So if you want to hear one talk, I point you to the Cyber Talk, if you want to have a panel, then I point you to that TEDx Punawiti talk. Now, last week, I myself ran a panel, and the topic of that was on data fears. So the question was, what are we afraid of? And the third point that I have in terms of serious content is that conversation with a couple of friends, including my friend Lisa Lin, who wrote this book with Josh Chin called The Surveillance State. So I really recommend for anybody interested in data, trust, interested in China, interested in social control and what is going on here, I do recommend this book by Josh Chin and Lisa Nin, The Surveillance State. Okay, I did credits or kickback here. I just think it's an amazing book. So the topics I picked for today is trust, serendipity, and curiosity. Trust. Can we trust, for example, that this camera will autofocus? I really am not so sure about it. It feels that something else is more important than me. And it's probably right. It probably knows something I don't know. Serendipity. So when I was thinking back what I'm most missing here in this year of the pandemic, it is serendipity. If you think about what happens at a conference, like when you pay those $16,000 to go to a TED conference, it is not about the speakers pontificating on stage. Actually, nobody really cares about the speakers, I would argue. It is about those side conversations. It's, in the case of many participants, the one time a year when they see their friends all brought together in one place. And that's what really people paying those $16,000 for. Serendipity. How can we create serendipity online? So I think it's amazing how Clubhouse, I think, is a piece of crap. But it gives people the illusion of being there. Oh, I was in the same room as Elon Musk. Wow. So Clubhouse, brilliantly executed, completely content-free, but really plays to something which people miss, serendipity. But they don't realize just how fake it is. It was interesting, actually, in this conversation, datafears.com, that I also noticed a certain asymmetry with Lisa Lin and me. I religiously read everything they write in the Wall Street Journal about privacy, about China, etc. But she only had once talked to me many years ago when we both lived in Shanghai. So that was interesting to realize this. So I'm still unhappy about my autofocus here and don't know what I can do besides, I guess, trusting the technology that they will figure out whether the orchid behind me or I'm the more important subject in this talk. All right. In the introduction, was introduced as the former chief scientist at Amazon. And that's true. Amazon only had one chief scientist. Looking back, it is fascinating for me how the principals have taken life on their own. So what was at the time a company of less than 1,000 people where Jeff Bezos and I had offices on the same floor, and now gets codified into those Amazon principles. And I have a few friends who got hired there in the last months and years. And it is interesting. And for me, the question is whether, if you have a if you have a company of, 1 million people, do you need such principles to run it on? Yeah. So is data a culture, or is data a cult? Is Amazon a culture, or is Amazon a cult? And I, as a German, of course, am extremely fast firing when I sense something like a cult. TED is a cult. And there's a wonderful New York Times article which was written a couple of years ago when we all were on the plane to go to Vancouver, called The Church of TED. And I just encourage you to read that article to see what actually the cult of conferences is about. Now, what I want to talk about is, what do I see in terms of technology? What have I seen come out in the last couple of years? So if you go by the decades, it was Google, where all of our content which we created in the world was made explicit. Then in the decade afterwards, I think it was Facebook in the West and WeChat in the East, where our connections were made explicit. And I still, it's crazy that Facebook really, just based on the social graph, not on the mediocre data scientists they have, but just based on the social graph, managed to make recommendations to people I haven't seen for years. So that's the second thing. First one, making everything, if the content people produced, searchable. The second one is create the social graph. Now, what I think is, for me, equally important is a little company called Otter, Otter. And you can get some, I think, a month for free if you go to weigend.com/Otter. So you might want to, if you have a screen, type this up, my last name, weigend.com/Otter. And actually, this is what Otter looks like. Otter listens to everything I say and creates in real time a transcript. And I think that is fascinating, how those data change the behavior of people. When everything you say, even, I don't know who of you uses sleep app that records, sounds while you sleep. I do. And, it is kind of embarrassing. But anyways, we want to talk about data. We want to talk about surveillance. I also should actually talk about my book while we're at it here, Data for the People, which starts with me requesting my dad's Stasi file, the secret police in East Germany, because he was in prison. The East Germans put him in prison because they thought he was an American spy. And then I got a letter back in 2003, 4, 5, saying we are sorry. To protect the identity of the informants of your dad, we cannot release the file. We actually destroyed all the content. But since you asked, we can send you the cover sheet of your own fire. And I thought, wow. I mean, they started the file when I was a grad student at Stanford, studying neural nets in the 80s. So that work of collecting data must have been incredibly hard. And now, of course, what the KGB wouldn't have gotten out of us under torture, we happily share on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Welcome to our time. But as I said, what's missing for me is serendipity. And as I was reflecting on people I work with, so for example, a couple of weeks ago, a crypto company called Injective Protocol, INJ, worth hundreds of millions of dollars now. I met the founder at an event at Stanford, and we just chatted. And those things, I think we really need to think how we can recreate. I don't have a solution, but I think that's an important element, what I would like to talk about to people here. A question I often get is that of mentoring. And I think I'm very fortunate in my current age that I know people who are 30 years younger than me, today's students, but I also know people who are 30 years older than me. For example, my friend Daniel Kahneman, and I don't actually have many books here on my shelf, as I'm happy to show you later. There's a very good conversation at weigend.com/Kahneman, Kahneman, weigend.com/Kahneman, about COVID, which we had almost a year ago. And it's interesting how time passes. And I think the best you can do is keep track of what you are doing in these days, which are very different, this year, which has been very different from anything before. So I don't know what advice to give you, but I can tell you what advice I gave Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, when I was her digital advisor. She asked me at dinner one evening, hey, what advice do you have for me? And I said, well, find a teenager, in your neighborhood, whatever, a son or daughter of your friends or something, and spend 1 hour a month where you listen to their world. And then in exchange, I know you're busy, but in exchange, give them an hour of your time and you tell them what you actually really think. So in my case, there's Josh, little Josh. I mean, not so little anymore. Josh is in Singapore. And Josh loves me to say Ambiguitätstoleranz, because he just loves the sound of the word. And Josh is my godchild, 14 years old, and it's fascinating to have somebody who trusts you, sharing their word with you. Equally well, I encourage you to find somebody who is, 30, 40 years older than you are, and who is curious about you, about your world, and in exchange, willing to change with you what they experience, how they are thinking about things. It really, I think, is, in terms of mentorship, one of the most important things I can hope will happen to you. And I know it is very hard in this world where serendipity is seriously reduced. So one question I often get from recent grads is, Andreas, particularly in China, who should I be working for? Should I be working for a big company? Should I just working for a small company? And my advice there is, it doesn't matter. What matters is who you work with. Do you want to really spend, at a startup, 15 hours a day with that person? If yes, go for it. If you have reservations, I almost promised you it won't work out. So, to go back to the event I did on Tuesday, Data Fears, it was interesting that most of the people I have known for decades. One of them, now the president of the university in Potsdam, and I were undergrads together, and so on and so forth. So I recommend, more interesting than me talking now, for you to watch that hour on datafears.com, a conversation of very smart people. And I would like to, the question about how to give you hope, I would like to end my initial words here with a prayer Reinhold Niebuhr had, which is, Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I think in this day of COVID, it is very important to not get bogged down by all the things we cannot do, but to focus on things we can do. So in that spirit, I'm ready for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. I think we couldn't have ended this 5th edition of Future Entrepreneurship in any better way. Thank you so much for your inspiration and your speech. However, before we end off, I would like to ask you some final questions. I think many of us students are wondering, what does a scientist at Amazon actually do?
Okay, great. A scientist at Amazon does what any scientist does. Experiments. So what is science about? Science is about doing experiments. Jeff Bezos would say, where reasonable people disagree. So there are thousands of things where people disagree. Reasonable people disagree. Questions we need to answer. And how do you resolve those? And Amazon has an amazing culture of doing experiments. And at the time, Jeff Bezos thought, it would be good to have somebody who actually knows about experiments. So I did my PhD in physics at Stanford, experimental physics, and I, did neural networks in the early days. And so doing experiments, figuring out how to formulate experiments, I think is what, a scientist does. And ultimately, it's not that complicated. It boils down to two things. One, knowing what to measure, and two, knowing how to normalize it. So what to divide it by, so you really get the answer to your question. So that's the essence of science.
Thank you. You're originally from Germany, but you got to study in the US. How did you get the opportunity to study abroad?
I think it was, there are many answers to this. My dad had the rule when, after the military service, where I played the cello, actually. Andreas, you can study whatever you want to study, but not in your hometown. So I think that was very good advice. Like, get out of the house. I mean, a very good relationship, but he knew it's time to leave when it's time to leave. So I actually studied in EE, electrical engineering. And most of my smart friends were in physics. So after 2 years getting the full diploma, I thought maybe I can also study physics.
Mhm.
And so I then went to Cambridge for a year. I had a scholarship from the German National Scholarship Foundation. And then I was at CERN. Right. Actually, now I remember. Wow, I hadn't thought about this. Thank you for the question. I was at CERN in the cafeteria at the Centre Européen de Recherche Nucléaire. I mean, in Geneva, right?
Yeah.
And my undergraduate prof from Karlsruhe, Julius Wess, we were standing in the line at the cafeteria talking about serendipity. And he said, so what will you be doing for your PhD? And I said, I haven't thought about it. And he said, well, you should go to Stanford. It's a good place. So in the map of we had Atlas. I looked up Stanford. It's near San Francisco. I'd never been to America. Sounds interesting. So I wrote a postcard. Dear Stanford University, please send me application materials. And there was no web at the time. And I got application materials. Then I went to Brussels to do the GRE. They said, we would be happy to have you. And I started at SLAC, the Stanford Linux Accelerator Center, the CERN equivalent. And then after 2 years, my advisor, Jonathan Dorfin, he said, Andreas, I think it's time to think about what you want to do for your thesis.
Mhm.
And I said, yeah, give me a week to think about it. He says, no problem. It was a Monday afternoon. So I went to his office. I'll never forget that moment. I went to this office and told him that, I really thought about it and I decided I don't want to do it at SLAC. I want to do it with some dude in psychology who invented something called neural networks. And I expect you to get thrown out of the office to have Jonathan say, Andreas, that's it. Thank you. Sorry, I wasted all my time on you. Done. But no. Jonathan listened and said, I will support you for another year. Then, you have to find your funding, but you have to make a promise. Once you get your PhD, you have to tell us what it actually is that you did. So you have to give a colloquium at SLAC, which I did. And then 20 years later, the Stanford Physics Department asked me whether I could give a colloquium, another colloquium, about my experience at Amazon and whatnot. I said, sure, but not by myself. I want to do it with Jonathan Dorfin. And so we two together talked about passion, about what actually leads people to be successful is that they are passionate about something.
Absolutely.
And then afterwards, I asked Jonathan, I told him a story. I thought you would just throw me out. And he said, here's my choice. Here's the choice I had. Yes, I can throw you out, but you would go anyways. So why would I not be genuinely nice and be a good role model for when you have grad students? Anyway, so what matters is who you work with or who you work for, much more than what it is that you actually do. That's what I think.
Absolutely. More than ever, people today are worried about their privacy due to fake news, data phishing, data fraud. How do you feel about this? Do you think that data can also be part of the solution?
Huh. How do I really feel about it? When I wrote my book 3-4 years ago, it's about data of the people and data by the people to be data for the people. I was much more positive about the what I call data refineries, Facebook, for instance. I've been deeply disappointed by Facebook's management, for instance, and the rather poor quality of the discovery algorithms they're producing. So I was, I'm hoping, having done recommendation algorithms for more than half of my life, that we would really have great discovery of things. But at the end of the day, it's just Messenger that I use. Google, on the other hand, I'm not sure whether you guys have your history on with Google. That's the price you pay. That Google, of course, much more knows what you're interested in because you ask Google all kinds of things you would not ask your partner. Google, of course, does an amazing job in showing me news articles I might be interested in. So, what was the question?
The question was that more than ever, people are worried about their privacy because there is a lot of fake news, there is a lot of fraud with the data. And the question is, can data also become part of the solution?
Right. So my key experience last year was that through a friend of mine, I had access for a few months to Clearview AI. Clearview AI is a facial recognition software, and it was amazing. Nobody, no civilian, has done more experiments with Clearview AI than I have, with hundreds of people. Just take a picture of them on their mobile, or your favorite person on OnlyFans. Take a picture of them, and then Clearview will show other pictures of them on the web. And then you look at what does it say underneath, or where is that page, and there is no privacy left. So that was the key experience of last year, that wow, unless you walk through town with a sock over your head, people who are interested will know who you are. The key experience I've had this year is with deepfake. So the company called Overdub, it's part of Descript, allows you to create a deepfake of your voice. And if you go to datafears.com, I started off with a minute or two of a deepfake of my voice. And people actually thought it was me speaking. And why this is interesting is that I think ultimately it gives us plausible deniability. That somebody says, we have recording of something you said. Once the deepfake is indistinguishable from reality, I never said that. And you have plausible deniability basically towards anything. That video, not me, just looks like me. That audio, not me. I'm actually trying to figure out how much training time Overdub really needs. Whether I can take, YouTube videos of a friend of mine or of an enemy of mine, and just feed that into Overdub, and then I type in the text, and it will say in the voice of that friend or enemy whatever I'm typing. Hallelujah! Welcome to not only the end of privacy, but to whatever came afterwards.
And do you think that we as citizens or even our students can become part of this debate on social data and the pros and cons on it, about it?
Absolutely. I think that data literacy is extremely important. And it's not easy. I mean, it takes a long time to become data literate. And I wrote my book, Data for the People, in an attempt to make people more data literate. And by the way, if you go to weigend.com/en, you can download the PDF as long as you don't tell my publisher. The important thing for me is that people actually read it and understand what they can do as citizens, as customers, what their rights should be.
So they participate themselves and they know what they're talking about. Exactly.
Yeah.
To end with, do you have any last encouraging words to our students that want to launch their own career?
I think I can just quote Jeff Bezos, just do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andreas Weigend, for your thrilling insight. It was an honor to have you here today at Future Entrepreneurship 2021, live from San Francisco. Enjoy your day, stay safe, and I hope we meet again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.